Starting today, everything changes, he said. Voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight that made the room feel smaller. I froze mid-step, the stack of documents in my hands suddenly heavier, my breath catching as I looked up at Dominic Thornton sitting behind his glass desk in the top-floor office. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, glinting off the polished surfaces and reflecting the city skyline beyond, but my attention was anchored entirely on him. He was impeccably dressed, suit tailored to perfection, posture rigid yet effortless, and his eyes locked onto mine with a quiet authority that made my chest tighten. I had been his assistant for 6 months, handling calendars, emails, and endless meetings, but this morning's request was unlike anything I had anticipated. A shift so sudden it made my heart race. I set the papers down carefully, hands trembling, trying to find words that would satisfy both my sense of professionalism and the curiosity that now prickled along my spine. I am listening, I managed, voice steady despite the flutter in my stomach. Dominic leaned back slightly, fingertips resting on the polished wood of the desk, studying me as if weighing my every reaction. I need you to handle this project differently, entirely under my direction, without deviation. Starting today, you report only to me and follow my instructions meticulously. His words were precise, controlled, and carried an invisible current of command that made ordinary instructions feel like a decree. I nodded slowly, processing the implications, realizing this meant my responsibilities would expand, my autonomy would be challenged, and yet there was a strange exhilaration in the certainty of his expectations. The office felt simultaneously vast and confining, each modern detail, the leather chair, the glossy desk, the city view, emphasizing his influence, his reach, and the quiet tension he radiated. I glanced down at my watch, aware that every second now carried weight, each decision potentially scrutinized by the man who had always seemed untouchable, yet somehow present in every corner of my working life. Dominic's gaze did not waver, and I felt the pull of his authority, magnetic and inescapable, threading into my thoughts and grounding me even as my imagination raced with possibilities. The sunlight caught the edge of a gold pen on his desk, glinting like a signal, and I realized that this small morning encounter had set a new rhythm, one in which my every movement, choice, and response would be measured against the quiet intensity of his expectations. A faint smile flickered across his lips, subtle but unmistakable, and for a moment I felt a connection, an acknowledgement of potential, of challenge, of mutual understanding that required no words beyond the ones already spoken. I exhaled slowly, straightened my posture, and stepped closer to the desk, ready to face the new rules, aware that this seemingly simple request would ripple through my day, my work, and my perception of him in ways I could not yet predict, and that beneath the control and authority there was an unspoken tension, a curiosity, and a beginning that neither of us could deny. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of schedules, phone calls, and meetings, yet nothing felt quite the same. Every time I glanced at my computer screen, I could feel the weight of Dominic Thornton's request lingering in the back of my mind. The office occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower overlooking Manhattan, and from my desk near the executive wing, I could see the city stretching endlessly beneath a sky of pale blue and silver clouds. Usually the view helped me focus. Today it only reminded me how much had changed in a matter of minutes. My inbox filled steadily with messages, but unlike before, every major decision now required direct approval from Dominic. The realization settled over me gradually. It was not just a new assignment, it was a complete shift in how I worked. Around noon, the glass door to his office opened. My attention lifted automatically. Dominic stepped out, speaking quietly into his phone as he crossed the hallway. Employees immediately adjusted their posture when he passed. Conversations softened. The atmosphere itself seemed to respond to his presence. He never demanded attention. Somehow, he commanded it naturally. His call ended as he approached my desk. Olivia. My name sounded different in his voice. More deliberate. I stood quickly. Yes. He placed a slim black folder on my desk. Review everything inside. I want your analysis by 3 o'clock. I blinked. My analysis? That surprises you? His expression remained unreadable. Normally I organize reports. I do not usually create them. You are capable of more than organizing them. The statement caught me off guard. Before I could respond, he continued. That is one reason I chose you. Chose me. The words lingered long after he walked away. For several seconds I simply stared at the folder resting on my desk. Then curiosity overcame hesitation. I opened it carefully. Inside were project proposals, financial summaries, and strategic plans involving one of the company's largest upcoming ventures. Material usually reserved for senior executives. My pulse quickened. This was far beyond my normal responsibilities. Across the office, coworkers moved between meetings, completely unaware that my role had shifted beneath my feet. I spent the next 2 hours studying every page. The deeper I read, the more I realized Dominic was testing me. Not with impossible tasks. With trust. He wanted my opinion. My judgment. My ability to see details others might overlook. By the time the clock reached 3, I had filled several pages with notes. Taking a steady breath, I carried the folder toward his office. The city skyline glowed beyond the enormous windows behind him. Sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, filling the room with gold and silver light. Dominic looked up as I entered. Finished? Yes. I handed him the report. He accepted it without speaking and began reading immediately. The silence stretched across the room. I clasped my hands together, trying not to appear nervous. Finally, he looked up. You found 3 issues the executive team missed. I stared at him. I did. A faint hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. Apparently. Heat rushed into my cheeks. I was just being thorough. Exactly. He closed the folder and placed it on his desk. Most people stop when they find the obvious answer. You keep looking. For the first time since entering the office, I allowed myself a small smile. Dominic held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Not uncomfortable. Not inappropriate. Just enough to make me aware that this conversation was about more than a report. Get used to this level of responsibility, he said quietly. You are going to need it. By mid-afternoon, the city below had grown quiet under a soft haze, sunlight filtering through scattered clouds and casting muted reflections across the glass facades of nearby skyscrapers. I sat at my desk, reviewing additional documents for the project Dominic Thornton had assigned, every page a reminder that my responsibilities had expanded far beyond the routine administrative tasks I was accustomed to. The office buzzed softly with activity, assistants and interns moving with purpose, but a subtle current of awareness ran through the room, an unspoken recognition of Dominic's presence even when he was not immediately visible. Occasionally, the door to his office would open, and he would appear in the hallway, walking briskly yet with calculated precision, his dark tailored suit immaculate, shoes clicking against the polished floors with authority that drew glances from anyone nearby. My own movements had become more measured, conscious of how each gesture and decision might be observed or assessed, and yet there was a strange exhilaration in rising to the challenge, a sense of being noticed for my abilities rather than merely my position. Around mid-afternoon, a meeting was scheduled, and I followed Dominic into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the skyline. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the ventilation and the distant murmur of the city, yet the energy between us was palpable. He gestured toward the chair at the head of the table, and I seated myself with an awareness of every subtle shift in his expression, every glance that might indicate his assessment of my judgment or composure. As he began to outline the strategic objectives and key decisions that needed attention, I realized that this interaction was as much about understanding his expectations as it was about the content of the reports themselves. Every suggestion I made, every question I asked was weighed and considered, and his responses, though calm and concise, carried an authority that shaped the rhythm of the discussion. The walls of the conference room reflected not only light but the quiet intensity of the interaction, creating a cinematic focus on the two of us as we navigated this professional challenge together. By the end of the session, I felt a shift within myself, a growing awareness of the subtle dynamics at play, the way Dominic's presence could guide without forcing, influence without demanding, and how my own confidence and understanding had begun to adapt to this new environment. Stepping out of the room, I felt both a heightened responsibility and a burgeoning curiosity about the man who had so seamlessly blended authority with measured guidance, realizing that each moment spent under his observation and interaction offered lessons beyond the scope of any document or assignment, and that the day was only the beginning of this intricate, evolving relationship of power, attention, and unspoken understanding. The meeting ended just before sunset, and the office gradually shifted into its evening rhythm. Most employees gathered their belongings and hurried toward elevators, eager to reclaim their personal lives from the demands of the day. I remained at my desk, reviewing notes from the conference room and organizing priorities for the following morning. The skyline beyond the windows had transformed into a canvas of amber and gold, sunlight stretching across the glass towers of Manhattan before slowly surrendering to twilight. The executive floor had become noticeably quieter. Phones rang less frequently. Conversations faded. Yet my attention remained fixed on the details of the project Dominic Thornton had entrusted to me. Every page seemed to carry a hidden lesson, every decision revealing another layer of the business empire he controlled. I was so focused that I almost missed the soft knock against my desk. Looking up, I found Dominic standing nearby. Without the constant movement of executives and assistants around him, his presence felt even more pronounced. The fading sunlight caught the sharp lines of his profile, casting long shadows across the polished floor. "You are still here," he observed. "So are you," I replied before I could stop myself. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across his features. Then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Fair observation." The reaction caught me off guard. Dominic rarely revealed emotion. Seeing even the smallest hint of amusement felt strangely significant. He glanced toward the documents spread across my desk. Most people would have gone home an hour ago. I looked down at the reports. Most people were not given responsibilities meant for senior executives. He studied me carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" The question seemed simple, yet something in his tone suggested he genuinely wanted the answer. I considered my response. "Honestly, always." I took a breath. Terrified, excited, confused, sometimes all at once. Dominic remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "Good." I blinked. "Good. People who are never nervous usually stop growing." His gaze shifted briefly toward the city outside. "Confidence is useful. Complacency is dangerous." The statement settled into my thoughts immediately. It sounded less like business advice and more like a philosophy he lived by. For the first time, I wondered what experiences had shaped the man standing in front of me. Dominic was younger than many executives who held similar levels of influence, yet he carried himself with the certainty of someone who had spent years navigating challenges most people would never encounter. The office lights automatically brightened as daylight faded, bathing the floor in a warm glow. Outside, thousands of city lights began appearing one by one, transforming Manhattan into a sea of illumination. Dominic slipped a hand into his pocket and looked back at me. "Have you eaten dinner?" The unexpected question pulled me from my thoughts. "Not yet." "Neither have I." His expression remained calm, unreadable. "There is a restaurant 2 blocks away that serves decent food." My pulse quickened. It sounded casual, yet somehow nothing about Dominic Thornton ever felt casual. He watched me carefully, waiting for my answer. Around us, the executive floor stood nearly empty, the city sparkling beyond the glass walls like a world of endless possibilities. For the first time since entering his office that morning, I realized this story was moving beyond reports, meetings, and responsibilities. Something was changing between us, quietly and steadily, like the city lights appearing against the darkening sky, impossible to ignore once they had begun. The evening descended slowly over Manhattan, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and gray as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the skyscrapers. I stepped out of the office building, clutching my coat around my shoulders, feeling the gentle chill of the city air brushing against my face. The streets below were alive with the sounds of traffic, distant chatter, and the hum of the city that never truly slept. As I walked toward the corner cafe, my mind replayed the events of the day, Dominic Thornton's unexpected request echoing in every thought. The cafe was small but warm, with golden light spilling through the windows, illuminating the polished wood tables and shelves stacked with cups, coffee beans, and pastries. I entered, taking a moment to adjust to the quieter space, and immediately noticed Dominic sitting at a corner table, hands folded neatly on the surface, eyes fixed on the window as if contemplating the city beyond. He looked up as I approached, and a faint smile touched his lips, subtle yet unmistakable, acknowledging my presence without a word. I pulled out the chair across from him and seated myself, feeling the tension of the day ebb slightly but replaced with a quiet anticipation. The aroma of roasted coffee beans mingled with the distant sounds of footsteps and low conversation, creating a backdrop that felt intimate yet public, a space where our worlds intersected. Dominic reached for his cup, sipping slowly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, letting the quiet fill the space between us. "You handled the documents well today," he finally said, voice calm, deliberate, carrying the same authority that had defined him all morning. I nodded, faint blush warming my cheeks. "Thank you." I tried to anticipate what was needed. He studied me carefully, eyes lingering on my expression, and I felt the weight of his attention, not overbearing but insistent, as if each glance carried meaning. The conversation shifted naturally, from the work at hand to observations about the city, the cafe, and small moments that revealed character and subtle intention. I found myself relaxing, noticing the slight movements of his hands, the careful choice of words, the quiet confidence that suggested he had mastered the art of observation and control. Outside, the sky darkened, and the first hints of evening traffic lights reflected in the window pane, casting a warm glow across our table. I realized that this simple cafe visit, this ordinary moment, was infused with the tension, curiosity, and unspoken connection that had been building all day. Each word exchange seemed layered with meaning, each pause deliberate, creating an intricate rhythm that was both professional and deeply personal. As the coffee cooled in our cups, I understood that the day had shifted something fundamental between us, a quiet recognition of roles, power, and the subtle dance of trust and expectation that defined our evolving relationship. Dominic finally leaned back slightly, eyes meeting mine with an intensity that was calm yet magnetic, and in that moment I sensed the promise of what was to come, an unspoken understanding that this connection would continue to shape every day moving forward, quietly altering the rhythm of my work, my thoughts, and my perception of him, leaving me both challenged and intrigued by the man who could command attention without a single raised voice and influence without a word beyond those carefully chosen ones spoken earlier. When we finally left the cafe, the city had settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. Streetlights reflected across the sidewalks in long ribbons of gold, and a cool breeze moved between the buildings, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and conversation. Dominic held the door open as we stepped outside, a simple gesture that somehow felt more significant than it should have. I thanked him quietly, pulling my coat a little closer around my shoulders. For a moment we stood beneath the glow of the cafe sign, neither of us appearing eager to end the evening. It was strange. Just that morning, he had been the intimidating executive whose approval I worked tirelessly to earn. Now, after a day of unexpected responsibility and a conversation that had stretched far beyond business, I found myself seeing him differently. Not less powerful, if anything more so, but also more human. We began walking slowly down the block. The city seemed calmer at night, stripped of the rush and urgency that dominated daylight hours. Dominic kept an unhurried pace beside me, hands in his coat pockets, his attention focused entirely on our conversation. There was something remarkable about that. Most influential people I had met were constantly distracted by their phones, meetings, or schedules. Dominic never appeared distracted. When he listened completely. Why me? I asked suddenly. The question had been living in my head all day. He glanced toward me. Why you what? Why choose me for all of this? My hand moved vaguely through the air. The reports. The meetings. The responsibility. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, like he was considering the answer carefully. Because you pay attention. I blinked. That is it. A faint smile appeared. You say that as though it is unimportant. We stopped at a crosswalk as traffic moved through the intersection. Red taillights stretched into the distance beneath the glow of office towers and apartment buildings. Dominic looked ahead before continuing. Most people hear instructions. You listen for meaning. Most people see what is directly in front of them. You notice what others miss. The traffic light changed. We continued walking. His words settled somewhere deep inside me. Compliments from coworkers were one thing. Compliments from Dominic Thornton felt entirely different. Not because they were rare, because they felt earned. You make it sound like you have been watching me for months. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Yet, Dominic simply nodded once. I have. My pulse stumbled. What? I do not promote people based on assumptions. His tone remained calm. I observe. Somehow that explanation should have reassured me. Instead, it made me even more aware of him. The confidence. The certainty. The fact that every decision seemed intentional. We reached the corner where my apartment building stood a block away. The realization brought an unexpected disappointment. I was not ready for the evening to end. Apparently Dominic noticed. His gaze softened slightly. Tomorrow will be busy. I laughed quietly. That sounds suspiciously like a warning. It is. For the first time all evening, genuine amusement touched his expression. The sight was so unexpected that I found myself smiling back automatically. We stood there for another second, the city moving around us, lights glowing against the dark sky. Then Dominic looked at me with the same steady focus that had unsettled me from the beginning. Be ready at 8 tomorrow morning, Olivia. His voice lowered slightly. The real work starts then. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of the day replayed themselves in perfect detail. Dominic standing beside my desk, the unexpected responsibility, the conference room overlooking Manhattan, the quiet dinner, the way he had looked at me when he said he had been observing my work for months. By the time my alarm rang at 6:30, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling while early morning sunlight slowly brightened the room. A strange mixture of anticipation and nervous energy followed me through my morning routine. I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, something I rarely managed even on my most organized days. The city was just beginning to wake up. Commuters filled the sidewalks below. Yellow taxis moved through intersections, and sunlight reflected from hundreds of glass windows across the skyline. The executive floor remained unusually quiet when I stepped off the elevator. A few assistants were already at their desks, but most of the offices remained dark. As I settled into my chair, I noticed a familiar black folder waiting on my desk. My name was written neatly across the front. Olivia Bennett. Curiosity immediately replaced fatigue. Opening it carefully, I found a detailed itinerary for the day. Meetings, reports, site visits, strategy reviews. My eyes widened slightly. Dominic had not exaggerated. The schedule looked more demanding than anything I had ever handled before. Good morning. The voice came from behind me. I turned quickly. Dominic stood a few feet away, coffee in hand, perfectly composed as always. You are early. I smiled. You made it sound important. It is important. His gaze dropped briefly toward the folder. How do you feel? The question caught me off guard. Executives rarely asked how people felt. They asked if tasks were complete. Dominic seemed interested in both. A little overwhelmed. His expression remained calm. Good. I laughed despite myself. You seem to enjoy that answer. Because it means you understand the responsibility. He stepped closer to my desk, lowering his voice slightly. The people who concern me are the ones who believe difficult things should feel easy. I considered that for a moment. Somehow it sounded exactly like him. Controlled. Practical. Honest. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen briefly and then looked back at me. The first meeting starts in 20 minutes. I will be ready. I know. The confidence in his answer surprised me. He did not say he hoped I would be ready. He did not say he expected it. He simply knew. As the morning progressed, the pace intensified exactly as promised. We moved from conference rooms to executive offices, reviewing plans and discussing decisions that affected projects worth millions of dollars. Yet the most surprising part was not the workload. It was the way Dominic included me. He asked for my observations, requested my opinion, listened when I spoke. More than once, I noticed senior executives glancing toward me with confusion. I understood why. A few days ago, I had simply been another assistant. Now Dominic treated me like a trusted advisor in training. By noon, the city beyond the windows shimmered beneath bright sunlight. The office buzzed with energy. Meetings continued. Phones rang. People hurried through hallways carrying reports and tablets. Yet through all of it, I became increasingly aware of something unexpected. Dominic was not only changing my role, he was changing the way I saw myself. And for the first time, that realization felt far more intimidating than any responsibility he could possibly assign. By late afternoon, the sunlight had softened, spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite and creating long patterns across the polished floor. I remained at my desk, reviewing the progress of the morning tasks and preparing notes for the upcoming strategy discussion. Dominic Thornton entered quietly, carrying a tablet with several charts and reports displayed across the screen. His posture was composed, movements precise, yet there was a subtle energy in the way he approached, a quiet command that made the space feel charged even without words. "Have you prepared the brief for the marketing team?" he asked, voice calm but purposeful. I nodded, sliding the document toward him. He glanced at it, lips pressing briefly together, then returned his attention to the cityscape beyond the glass. "Good," he said finally. "We need clarity in every department, and I expect precision." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mix of tension and excitement that came with his expectations. Each instruction, though simple in wording, carried weight. I watched as he swiped across the tablet, reviewing the graphs and notes with meticulous attention, occasionally making a subtle mark or gesture that guided the focus of the report without directly speaking. The office was quiet, only the sound of typing and the soft hum of the air system filling the gaps. I realized that this routine, the precise flow of work under his watchful eyes, was teaching me far more than the documents themselves. It was teaching timing, awareness, and the ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Outside, the streets glimmered with reflections from passing traffic, and the sky began to deepen into a soft twilight, casting shadows that danced across the city skyline. Dominic lowered the tablet and turned toward me, expression steady but eyes sharp, as if measuring not just my work, but my understanding, my focus, my presence in the room. "Remember," he said quietly, almost conversational yet deliberate, "attention to detail defines outcomes. What is overlooked becomes lost." I nodded, feeling the gravity in his words and the subtle encouragement they carried. We spent the next hour reviewing key performance indicators, discussing projections, and refining strategies for the upcoming week. Each moment felt layered. The mundane work transformed into a lesson in observation and precision under his guidance. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, casting the city in deep blue hues, Dominic straightened, glanced toward the lights that now glittered across the skyline, and offered a rare, faint smile, just enough to hint at acknowledgement and approval. The moment lingered with me long after he left the room, the rhythm of his presence, the balance of authority and subtle mentorship, echoing in my mind as I prepared to leave, aware that every day under his direction would continue to reshape not only my understanding of the work, but also my awareness of him and the quiet power that shaped our professional connection. The following morning arrived with clear skies and a brilliant sunrise spilling across the Manhattan skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of gold and silver. I stood near the window of my apartment for a moment before leaving, coffee warming my hands as I watched the city come alive below. Something felt different. The uncertainty that had followed me through the first days of this new responsibility had begun to settle into something steadier. Confidence, perhaps. Or maybe trust. By the time I reached the office, the executive floor was already moving at full speed. Phones rang. Conversations flowed through open doorways. Elevators opened and closed with constant rhythm. Yet as I stepped into the familiar space, I no longer felt like an outsider trying to keep up. For the first time, I felt like I belonged there. The realization surprised me. My desk had become a command center of schedules, reports, and strategic plans. The projects that once seemed intimidating now felt manageable. Challenging certainly, but no longer impossible. As I organized the morning priorities, I noticed movement through the glass wall of Dominic Thornton's office. He was standing near the window, reviewing documents while the city stretched endlessly behind him. The sight was familiar now, yet somehow it still captured my attention. There was a certainty in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that influenced everyone around him without effort. A few minutes later, his office door opened. "Olivia." I stood immediately. "Good morning." He studied me for a moment, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Walk with me." Together we moved through the executive floor, passing conference rooms and offices filled with activity. Employees greeted him respectfully. Several nodded toward me as well. It was a small detail, but I noticed it. The perception had changed. People no longer saw me only as an assistant. They saw someone trusted by the man leading the organization. We eventually stopped near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Morning sunlight reflected across the glass, creating a breathtaking view of Manhattan below. Dominic rested one hand in his pocket and looked out across the skyline. "Do you remember your first day here?" he asked. I laughed softly. I was terrified. "You hid it well." "No, I did not." A faint smile touched his lips. "Perhaps not." The silence that followed felt comfortable, easy, the kind that only existed when two people understood each other without needing constant conversation. Finally, Dominic turned toward me. "You have exceeded every expectation I had." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were dramatic, because they were sincere. I looked away briefly, gathering myself. "You gave me the opportunity." "No," his voice remained calm but firm. "I gave you responsibility. You earned everything else." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Beyond the glass, the city continued moving beneath the bright morning sky. Thousands of people rushing toward meetings, ambitions, and goals. Yet standing there, I realized the most important change had not happened in the office. It had happened within me. Dominic had challenged me, trusted me, and forced me to see possibilities I had overlooked in myself. And somewhere along the way, the distance between employer and assistant had evolved into something deeper, built on respect, understanding, and unwavering confidence. As we turned and walked back toward the heart of the executive floor, surrounded by sunlight and opportunity, I understood that the journey that began with a single unexpected request had transformed far more than my career. It had changed the way I saw my future, and for the first time, I was genuinely excited to discover what came next.